news movie where the girl gets the guy. You will cry through me every time you walk by. I keep waiting for the heartbreak music that's never gonna come. Cause if you don't want me, then you're not the one.
Welcome back. How's everyone feeling this morning? Yeah? I know what I chat to my wife about. I'm going to a conference to learn things. Like, you're just going to get pissed. Anyway, so a little bit about me. Hi, I'm Lucas. I'm from Seek. I'll be your chair today. Just a few quick reminders just to use the app. The next couple of speakers are coming in from a virtual sense. So if you can use the app to ask questions, I will get them and then I can ask on the microphone and the speaker will actually hear them. Cool. So next up we have John Grimm. So John has over 18 years experience leading investigations of data breaches and cybersecurity incidents within the government and civilian security sectors. Currently, as a distinguished architect, John leads the Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center, or VTRAC, research, development, and innovation effort. In this role, he focuses on all aspects of cybersecurity incidents. That's quite loud. Right, yeah, so in this role, let me speak louder then. In this role, he focuses on all aspects of cybersecurity incidents, performing digital forensic examinations, advising on data breach containment and eradication efforts, and creating data breach response preparedness training and breach simulation exercises for customers worldwide. After I push through to John, I might run next door and tell him to shut it, keep it down over there. All right, so he's going to be talking about out of the shadows into the digital crosshairs. So John, it's quite, I don't know if you can hear, but it's quite loud in this room. I'm about to duck next door and tell him to be quiet. But for the first little bit, if you can just speak up a little bit, that'll be really good because it's quite loud in here. So can we give a warm welcome for John? And, oh, there we go. Can we give a warm welcome for John? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me okay, folks? Good morning. This is John Grimm here with the Verizon Threat Research Advisory Center. So I'm very, very happy to be here participating in AUS CERT this year. I'm calling in from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania over here in the States. It's nighttime, my time. So hopefully as the sun starts to fall, you'll still see me bright and glowy. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start looking at the Cyber-Espionage Report. So for me, I do research development and innovation for the VTRAC team, many, many years of investigations from the government standpoint and from the corporate standpoint. And one of the more challenging type of investigations that I've seen over the years in both realms, government and corporate, is the espionage investigations. But what are cyber espionage breaches? Okay, so this is the ground rules here for today's discussion. So it's a very specific definition that we use for cyber espionage. So first and foremost, for today, we're talking about data breaches where there's a confirmed compromise of data. We're not talking about cybersecurity incidents. We're talking about the most successful threat actors and what they've been able to do in terms of breaching the environment, exfiltrate data. Now, this data that we're going to be talking about today is from the Data Breach Investigations Report, which is our annual report that we literally just released its 14th edition today. And so this is a study into data breaches. So I'm going to be using data from the DBIR and looking at 7 years worth of data. So the DBIR itself defines cyber espionage as an espionage motive conducted by external threat actors. So we're talking about external to the organization who are enabled via unauthorized network or system access. And this is largely done by nation state or state affiliated threat actors looking for specific types of data, such as sensitive information, trade secrets, and proprietary information. So as you can imagine, these threat actors pose a unique challenge. They use advanced tradecraft and they have a specific focus in terms of what they're doing. They can move swiftly to gain access, and they can enter into heavily defended environments, and they don't necessarily leave right away. They may stay and dwell. move laterally through the network, waiting for the next set of taskings before they fulfill their obligations. So I'll talk about the dwell time as well and what the data really says to us. So in terms of the data itself, we're looking at the espionage motive, okay, with threat actors from an external location. The pattern that we're looking at is the cyber espionage breaches, which is a pattern that we've covered in the DBIR since 2014. We'll look in the data set, we do cover 3 regions in the report. Today, I won't be covering the 3 regions, but we do have information for APAC, EMEA, as well as the Americas. We do cover 7 industries in the report, the 7 industries that are most impacted by cyber espionage threat actors. Today, I'll be focusing on the 7 years worth of data and roughly, or actually specifically 1,580 breaches. So, couple other things I wanted to talk about real quick for compass points and direction in terms of the discussion. So we're going to use a framework that's known as the varus framework. You see vocabulary for event reporting and incident sharing. It's a framework that was designed several years ago to help facilitate the collection of incident and data breach data for analysis and for sharing. You can also use it for metrics and threat hunting, cyber threat modeling, risk management, etc. So today we're going to be looking at the data using the varus framework, and we're going to be specifically looking at the A4 threat model, which is a subcomponent of varus. It's the actors, the actions, the assets, and the attributes to help understand what we're seeing with cyber espionage threat actors. If you're interested in learning more about the varus framework, you can see the link there on the bottom left of your screen, varuscommunity.net, as well as github.com. And I'll provide these links at the end of the presentation as well. So one other standard we're going to use today for the discussion, or at least to highlight some of the controls and countermeasures that come into play with cyber espionage threat actors, is the Center for Internet Security Critical Security Controls. There are actually 20 of them that you can see on your screen. When all said and done, we'll whittle these down to the top 12 that are most relevant for the findings in the Cyber Espionage Report and for today's discussion. Now, be advised, the CIS controls have been updated, and version 8 should be coming out next week in terms of a revamp of these 20 controls. There's actually going to be 18 with several of them switched around and changed up in terms of the numbering system. But for today, we'll use version 7 of the critical security controls. So the state of cyber espionage, what are we seeing in terms of the data-driven insight for that 7-year time frame, okay? So, well, first and foremost, when we look at the DBIR data set from all the different contributors, and in essence, last year we had 81 different contributors to the DBIR. This year we had 83 different contributors from all around the world. Over that 7-year period, we see the same thing in terms of motives. The top 2 motives over that time frame are financial and espionage. In fact, you can see here, as I highlight in figure 38 and figure 37, for the 7-year time frame, 76% of the time when we look at data breaches, we're looking at a financially motivated threat actor. 18% of the time, we're looking at an espionage motivated threat actor. Now, last year, those numbers were 86% and 10% respectively. But generally speaking, these are the 2 biggest motivations that we see. Espionage is a distant second, but it can be a very troublesome threat actor in terms of espionage. And it's very likely that 18% is a lot higher, meaning this is probably a category that's underreported and it's underdetected as well. And I'll talk more about that and why we suspect that number of 18% over 7 years is probably a lot higher. Incidentally, one of the things that we've also seen for the trends over the years, as you can see in the bottom left, is the blue line is espionage, the green line is, the blue line is financial, the green line is espionage. They tend to move at mirror opposites of each other over the years. A lot of that has to do with the data that's collected, but a lot of that also has to do with the trends. For example, we're seeing ransomware being more and more a part of data breaches over the last few years. So that's definitely impacting the financially motivated numbers that you're seeing. So in terms of the industries, I mentioned there were 7 industries that we focused on for the cyber espionage report. We actually do have data for many more of those industries. You can see here in figure 16. This is when we look across the entire data set, what we see in terms of cyber espionage across the industries. Now, this is just across the data set in figure 16, so you can see public administration there is at 31%. And you can imagine that that's probably a lucrative target in terms of espionage for threat actors because they're looking for nation state advantage. Where else to find it but in the public sector? Manufacturing is number 2 at 22%, and professional, which is more like consulting, is at 11%. Now that's across the entire data set, looking at 1,580 breaches over the 7-year time frame. Figure 17, when we look within each one of those industries, we see a little bit of a different dynamic there. For example, manufacturing was 22% in figure 16, but when we look within manufacturing at the 985 data breaches that occurred, we see 344 of them are actually cyber espionage related. So that's one out of 3, 35%. So a much higher percentage when we look within each industry. Other examples there are public administration, 2,152 data breaches. Of those, 485 of those are cyber espionage related. And you can see financial there at the bottom, 2,797 data breaches, but only 42 of those are cyber espionage related. The vast majority of the other breaches are financially motivated in that sector. But just because an industry doesn't rank high for cyber espionage on these charts doesn't mean they can't be a victim of cyber espionage. Every industry has some kind of trade secrets or proprietary information that needs to be protected from cyber espionage threat actors. So some other ways to look at threat actors, and in particular for the cyber espionage threat actors, is from timelines or time frames. So this first slide here is timelines of attackers. The second slide after this will be timelines of the defenders. Now, when you're seeing the dark color green, which is generally speaking on the left-hand side, that's cyber espionage. On the right-hand side is all breaches, the dark blue. Okay, so if you recall, all breaches are dominated by a financial motive. So you can kind of equate that to financially motivated breaches, generally speaking. Whereas on the left-hand side for the cyber espionage, that's pure espionage motive. Okay, so when we look at figure 6 and figure 7, which is time to compromise, the time it takes for the threat actors to get into the environment, we see a bit of a difference. For the all breaches, which is dominated by that financial motive in figure 7, we see that generally speaking, we're talking seconds to minutes 85% of the time. In fact, 70% of the time it's minutes. But when we look at time of compromise for cyber espionage breaches, we see a different dynamic there. It's seconds to days, and it's kind of flatlined there, 23%, 19%, 23%, 26% for seconds to days. So this is your low and slow or slow and low movement by these threat actors. They're very methodical, whereas for the all breaches dominated by that financial motive, they tend to be much faster. For time to exfiltration, we can see that it's minutes to weeks for cyber espionage breaches versus minutes to days for all breaches. So again, a little bit slower here in terms of the cyber espionage threat actors. Now, when we look at the cyber defenders in those timelines, we're looking at time to discovery and time to containment. So for time to discovery, this to me is very interesting. It really does tell the tale of dwell time. For cyber espionage threat actors, it's months to years, 69% of the time. And that's years plural. And you can see that on the chart there in figure 10, 39% of the time it's years. That's a long time for those threat actors to be in the environment, a lot of damage that can potentially occur with that dwell time. But when we look at time to discovery in figure 11 for all breaches, again, dominated by a financial motive, we see it peaks at 38% for months, and then it trends down to 12% for years, okay? And if you think about it, it makes sense. For financial threat actors, they're looking to conduct a PCI attack, payment card industry attack, business email compromise, fraud, stealing PHI, PII data, and then looking to monetize that quickly. Whereas when we look at the cyber espionage threat actors, and in particular, shortly, we'll look at the data, they're looking for data that isn't going to be monetized right away. They're looking for data that's going to give them competitive advantage, nation state advantage, and that's your trade secrets and proprietary information. So it's not going to be discovered by an external fraud entity or law enforcement or CPP analysis or customers where their credit card goes fraud or financially motivated threat actors. Nobody may be missing the data in figure 10 that's been exfiltrated by the cyber espionage threat actors, and therefore they're going undiscovered for months and years. When we look at time to containment, which also includes time to recovery, it's a little bit more normal between figure 12 and figure 13. It's days to months for cyber espionage, hours to weeks for financial threat actors. Now, if you've done digital forensics investigations like I've done, you know that it can take a while to dig out the cyber espionage threat actors from the environment. They tend to be pretty embedded. They're living off the land, they're blending into the forest, whereas for the financially motivated threat actors, the all breaches there in figure 13, once you find that RAM scraper for PCI attacks or the malware that they're using, it's rather quick to contain and eradicate as compared to cyber espionage. Now, in terms of discovery, this was interesting as well. In figure 31 at the top is cyber espionage breach discovery. Figure 32 on the bottom, blue bars, is the all breaches for discovery. And we're seeing two different, generally speaking, at the top three for both of these categories, two different ways that these breaches are being discovered. For example, in figure 32 for all breaches, it's the law enforcement at 28%, fraud detection at 19%, customers at 15%. Somebody's missing that data. Somebody's missing the monetary value of that data. Somebody's detecting it being sold on the dark web. Somebody's seeing fraud and notifying the victim organization, the merchant, that maybe they've had a PCI breach. Whereas in figure 31 for cyber espionage breaches, we've got technical detection means internal to the organization, which is different than what we're seeing in figure 32, at least the top three categories. And these technical detection or discovery means are suspicious traffic at 48% of the time. 48% of the time, that's 1 out of 2 times it's suspicious traffic that leads to the discovery of cyber espionage breaches. Antivirus at 23%, and then the computer emergency response team at 7%. So these are internal technical discovery means, but they're taking a lot longer to discover cyber espionage breaches than all breaches or the financially motivated breaches are being discovered. Incidentally, on the bottom left of the screen are the top controls for the critical security controls. For the timeline slides as well, they're down at the bottom left here. Things such as maintenance, monitoring, analysis of audit logs, your malware and boundary defenses, as well as your incident response capabilities. So let's look at the A4 threat model here to better understand what the threat actors are up to, so we can kind of see the difference between the cyber espionage versus the all breaches. So the A4 threat model is a subcomponent of varus. These are the 4 A's: the actors, the actions, the assets, and the attributes. Now this, you can kind of maybe even think of this as similar to the diamond model. The actors and the actions actually go hand in hand, and the assets and the attributes go hand in hand as well. So let's look at the actors. There are 3 types of actors that we track within the DBIR and within the varus framework. They're the external, internal, and partner. So external actors do not have any legitimate access to the environment. They're external physically and logically to the data, the assets, and the environment. Internal actors are your employees, your system administrators, your end users, folks who have some level of trust and privilege. They're not necessarily an insider threat, but they're doing things that lead to a breach, such as committing errors, misconfigurations. Partners are somewhere in between in terms of their access. They're not quite external, they're not quite internal. They have some level of trust and privilege. So historically, what you're seeing here in the screen for actors, the bottom left shows you those 3 actor types. The blue is the external actors. They have been the #1 actor over the 7-year time frame. Green is the internal, a distant second, but the #2 actor. And then partners are on the gray line at the very bottom, okay? So for today's discussion, we're looking at external actors, okay? And we're gonna be looking at those external actors, again, continuing with the espionage motive. So figure 34 is the cyber espionage breaches at the top, and figure 35 is the all breaches. And keep in mind that that's dominated by that financial motive. So I highlighted here that the top actor varieties within both of those 2 figures that you see here. So the actor varieties are actually 1 layer below the actor types. So for instance, we've got state affiliated highlighted there. That is an external actor. Nation state is external actor, as well as organized crime. But when we see former employee, that's also an external actor. Competitor is external, but when you see end user and activate, or end user and developer, those are internal actors, just for clarification there. So when we compare 34 and 35, the two figures there, we see state affiliated is number one by far at 85% for cyber espionage breaches, and that's probably no surprise. Nation state is number two at 8%. So combined, those two are 93% of the time that you're dealing with a state affiliated or nation state threat actor. Now, state affiliated isn't quite nation state. They're supported, blessed off, or at least approved by or affiliated in some way, shape, or form to the nation state. On the bottom there, the number one threat actor for all breaches is organized crime at 59%, a very, very high percentage compared to the next category, which is state affiliated at 13%. So that makes sense. Organized crime tends to align with the financial motive. And when we're looking at all breaches, that's dominated by the financial motive. So when we're looking at these two, we're seeing state affiliated versus organized crime in terms of the two categories. Now, we're not going to talk about actions right now. I'm going to hold that off until a little bit later. But these are the assets. This is on the victim side of the coin. Okay, and these are the 7 asset types that we track within the DBIR and reported within the Cyber-Espionage Report. So we've got server, people, user device, terminal, network, embedded, and media. We're going to focus today on server, people, and user device, and to a certain extent on network. So these are the asset types. This is great to know. But what's even more informative is the details, which are the asset varieties that underlie each of these asset types. So in terms of assets, this is what we're seeing in figure 24 and tip 25 for cyber espionage versus all breaches, okay? So in parentheses is the asset type. Outside of the parentheses is the asset variety. So for example, desktop or laptop, in parentheses is a user device type. So the variety is desktop or laptop. So interestingly, for cyber espionage threat actors in figure 24, we see that they are targeting desktops or laptops, and mobile phones. The top 3 categories there are user devices. Then that 4th category there is a network type, which is a router or switch. On the right-hand side, when we look at the asset varieties for all breaches dominated by that financial motive, we see that those threat actors are mixing it up more so than the cyber espionage threat actors. Desktop or laptop, yes, certainly is number one, but next we see a server, web application server, and that makes sense because within the overall DBIR data set, we see web app server attacks, or web app attacks, I should say, being a very, very high percentage in terms of a go-to for breaches in general, in terms of those threat actors. E-commerce attacks, presence that folks have on the internet for their businesses. And so that just makes sense. And then there's the desktop there, and then point of sale controller and point of sale terminal, which is affiliated with PCI attacks. Database servers, customers, yes, we do code people as assets, and email servers as well. So a big difference there in terms of assets. The cyber espionage threat actors are targeting the user, and more specifically the user devices to gain access into the environment. So the attributes, we track the 3, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability, the CIA triad in terms of types. So in terms of integrity, this is the attribute variety for integrity, okay, and the attribute variety for confidentiality. Okay, availability is not on here. Typically, the availability would be more affiliated with cybersecurity incidents, DOS attacks, ransomware incidents. But here we're talking about breaches. So the top compromised attribute varieties are more confidentiality related and integrity related. Now, for what you're seeing in figure 20 and figure 21, this is integrity that I've highlighted here. These are the top integrity related attribute varieties for cyber espionage and for all breaches. So interestingly, most of the time so far, we've talked about 2 different tails between all breaches and cyber espionage breaches. What we're seeing here is the top 2 attribute varieties impacted by breaches for both cyber espionage and all breaches is software installation and alter behavior. So software installation is what it sounds like. It's impacting the installation of the software. You can think of a recent example like SolarWinds, the attack there. Okay, so this is 7 years worth of data. This is prior to SolarWinds. This has been going on for some time where the threat actors are taking advantage of software installation and corrupting that, impacting the integrity of that whether they're doing cyber espionage or whether they're doing financially motivated breaches. Now, when you look at the percentages, you can see 91% for cyber espionage versus 43% for all breaches. But again, the number one compromise attribute variety is software installation, followed by the human element, altering behavior, altering the integrity of that person, getting somebody to click on a hyperlink in a phishing email or go to a fake website, getting somebody to do something that they shouldn't be doing, leading to a data breach. So alter behavior is the number two for both cyber espionage and for all breaches. And then we're going to cover confidentiality in the next slide, but you can see there's a bit of a divergence then for cyber espionage. We're talking about modifying the configuration of something versus fraudulent transaction in terms of all breaches. So a bit to learn here in terms of the attributes when it comes to cyber threat actors and all breaches in general. If you look at the confidentiality, this is probably one of the more contrasts here between the two different types of data that we're looking at today. So on the left-hand side in figure 29 is top compromised data varieties, which is impacting confidentiality in cyber espionage breaches. And what you're seeing there is your trade secrets at 75%, internal data at 30%, followed by credentials, system, and government classified information at 9%. Okay, so this is, you can kind of think of this as the intangible data as compared to tangible data in figure 30. This is the data that needs to be defined. This is your trade secrets. This is your proprietary information. But it's information that's not as easy to grep for. It's rather easy to look for social security numbers that are walking out the door, but it's not so easy to look for trade secrets. You have to understand where they are in your environment and what they are to be able to look for them in that suspicious traffic. And in figure 30, we can see it's a bit of a different story here in terms of the data that's compromised. We're talking user credentials, okay? And user credentials are number 3 on the list in figure 29, but they're number 1 on the list for figure 30 at 31% because those can be monetized. Those can be exfiltrated from the environment and sold on the dark web to give another hacker, another attacker access back into that environment. Personal information is at 31%, and that's your PII. Payment, 23%, that's your PCI. Medical, 13%, that's your PHI. All data types there in that red box that can be monetized for quick gain by those financially motivated threat actors. Okay, and I know we're talking all breaches, but keep in mind, 76% of the time over that 7-year period is the financial motivation that dominates. Whereas in figure 29, we're seeing data that we wouldn't expect it to be sold on the dark web. It's going to be used in a closed loop system. It's going to be used by that state affiliated entity, that nation state for competitive advantage, for national security advantage. And they're not going to be selling that data on the dark web. The credentials are going to be used for access back into the environment or greater access within the environment if they happen to get a hold of some system administrative credentials. But let's talk about the actions. So there are 7 action types that we track and we've tracked over the years for the Data Breach Investigations Report. Today, we're going to talk about social malware and hacking. I will comment that misuse goes hand in hand with the internal actors. This is misuse or abuse of something, hardware, software, credentials, okay? And we would need to pair up the misuse action with the internal actor to get ourselves to the point where we have an insider threat. Error is big in terms of breaches. It was big last year in the DBIR. We're not going to talk about error today. And then physical and environmental are probably our 2 least impacted action types that we've seen over the years for data breaches. So for actions, looking at a very high level here at the action types, you can see the top 3 action types are the same for cyber espionage breaches and all breaches: malware, social, and hacking, malware, and social, respectively. But what we see for cyber espionage breaches is there's much more of a reliance, percentage-wise, on malware, social, and hacking, ranging between 80 and 90% of the time, versus figure 40 with all breaches, where we're seeing social malware and hacking ranging from 29 to 56% of the time. In fact, you can see in figure 40, error is at 16%, misuse is 11%, and physical is at 6%, whereas it's barely represented in figure 9. Misuse is at 2%. Incidentally, a good example of physical would be payment card skimmers, and that's why that's looking at 6% there for all breaches because of that financial motivation. So this is great, but this is not very helpful. Let's look one layer down below the action types to the action varieties for the malware, the social, and hacking. So we'll talk about social first. So social, and this is probably a surprise to folks, for all breaches in figure 44, 87% of the time, the threat actors are leveraging email, social engineering, phishing, spear phishing. 9% of the time, it's pretexting, okay? But for cyber espionage, it's surprising to me that it was actually outpacing all breaches. And if you look at figure 43, you see cyber espionage 97% of the time when they're using social attacks, they're using phishing. But only 2% of the time for pretexting. So I would have thought, well, cyber espionage, pretexting should be a lot higher than 2%. Well, it's actually higher in all breaches at 9% than it is in cyber espionage. So another example here of where the two tails are the same between cyber espionage breaches and all breaches, but most of the time we've seen a lot of difference in terms of the data when we look at both data sets. So hacking is the second action type that we'll look at. Now these are the action varieties for hacking. The top is cyber espionage, the bottom is all breaches. So when we look at the way that the hackers tend to operate, we see that for cyber espionage threat actors, they leverage the use of a backdoor or a C2 command and control channel 86% of the time. That's their go-to hacking action variety, okay? Now you're probably wondering, well, backdoor or C2, those are two different things. Yes, they are, but this is just the hacking action variety. The next slide will have malware, and we'll see that those are split out separately. Next is use of stolen credentials at 30%, and if they don't have those stolen credentials, they're brute forcing at 12%. And when we look at all breaches in figure 46, we see use of stolen credentials is at 63%. And that makes sense. That's what we've been seeing a number of years in terms of financially motivated threat actors and all breaches in general. Use of backdoors at 39%, and then brute forcing is at 18%. So this is hacking action varieties. Now let's look at malware. Okay, so this is malware action varieties. Left side is cyber espionage, and right side is all breaches. So here's the split out between backdoor and C2 in figure 47. 78% of the time it's backdoor, 77% of the time it's C2. When we look over in figure 48 at all breaches, we see C2 is only at 48%. And then you can see you don't even see backdoor until it's 25% right down below the red box, okay? So for the cyber espionage threat actors, by far, their malware go-to varieties are backdoor and C2. And then distantly, they're at third and fourth is downloader at 40% and captured stored data at 40%. If we look over at all breaches in figure 48, we see spyware keylogger at 40%, RAM scraper at 35%, and then it starts falling off from there. One of the things I want to point out is halfway down both charts, you see adminware. Adminware at 7% in figure 48, adminware at 21% in figure 47. This is your living off the land. So the cyber espionage threat actors prefer, to the extent they can, to use the tools that are already in the environment. Why bring additional tools into the environment and risk detection? Why not just use the tools that are already there? PSExec, PowerShell, any admin tools. If you've got the admin privileges, the tools are there, you use them, and that's what they do. They know that that'll lessen their chance for detection, or at least delay detection. They also know that it'll delay the investigative response effort when the forensics folks are looking for artifacts on the systems and looking at log entries, and they're seeing a mixture of legitimate activity with that particular tool and nefarious activity with that particular tool. And it does slow down the investigative response effort, because then you have to determine what were the good guys and girls doing versus what the threat actor was doing. Other things such as scan network and disable controls are all examples of what the threat actor would do at 18%, 13% in terms of living off land and modifying configurations and disabling things. Whereas you're not seeing that as high of a percentage over in the all breaches category, because those threat actors tend to, it's not that they're not as sophisticated as cyber espionage threat actors, they're just looking at different data types, and they're looking to get in, exfiltrate that data, and monetize it as quickly as possible. So they're not so concerned about the dwell time. Okay, so way forward. So just to kind of highlight some of the findings here that we went over today, Please check out the Cyber-Espionage Report. There's all kinds of additional data in the report. There's also 2 pages dedicated to 7 of the industries in terms of specifics with cyber espionage. So at a high level here, when we're looking at actors, 93% of the time we're dealing with state-affiliated and nation-state actors for cyber espionage. 91% of the time we're dealing with the attributes of software installation, which is impacting integrity at 91%. And then we see alter behavior, which is impacting integrity at 84%. 90% of the time we're dealing with malware action, followed by social at 83% and hacking at 80%. And then in terms of assets, keep in mind for cyber espionage threat actors are targeting those user devices, desktops or laptops at 89%, desktops at 80%, and mobile phones at 9%. So these are the A4 threat model elements: actors, actions, attributes, and assets. When we look more deeply into action types or action varieties, 97% of the time, we're dealing with phishing at 97%, pretexting at 2%, and bribery at 1%. And then for hacking, 86% of the time, we're dealing with use of backdoor C2, followed by use of stolen credentials at 30%, and brute force at 12%. Malware at 78% is backdoor, followed by command and control at 77%. Your downloader, and you're capturing stored data. And then also in terms of vectors, malware vectors for that pair up, generally speaking, with the malware action varieties, where email attachments at 67% and email links at 17%, followed by web drive-bys and download by malware. So this is an eye chart. I do realize that, but this is spelled out in the actual report itself. What we do is we map the varus category on the very left with the cyber espionage report key takeaways on the next column. And in the very center are the top Center for Internet Security critical security controls, version 7, with the mappings there to the findings. And then on the far right is the deduplicated controls down to the 12 unique ones that we came up with in terms of the insight provided by the cyber espionage reports. So these are the 12 controls, and so you can see them. These are the 12 highlighted in green out of the 20 security controls. If you're interested in Varus and learning more, you can simply go to varuscommunity.net. It's an open source framework. You can use Varus to code your incidents within your organization. You can use Varus to better understand the DBIR and the cyber espionage report. There's also a web application app, or a web app, I should say, on github.com. You can use that to go ahead and code your incidents. And we also do have an open source Varus Community Database project where we code publicly disclosed breaches and cybersecurity incidents for use for analysis, as well as being a contributor to the DBIR itself. I do want to just let folks know the link on the very bottom of your screen for the DBIR is live. We just went live today for the 2021 Data Breach Investigations Report. 14 years of data, 88 countries, 83 contributors, 29,207 quality incidents analyzed, and 5,258 data breaches analyzed. Lots of good information in there in terms of what we're seeing with breaches, especially in the age of COVID. So COVID-19 data from last year is included in the report. That brings us to the very end. We do have a couple minutes. Is there any questions?
Cool, thank you, John. Can we have a round of applause for John quickly? Now you can submit questions via the app, and there was one question in there which I can answer as part of the OSCERT team. With any questions on the floor, we do only have a couple of minutes before a hard stop. No questions on the floor. So there was a question around the presentation being made available, and it will be via YouTube at a later date. Cool, so thank you so much, John, and thank you for whatever time it is over there, dialing in early or late. I'm sure it's really difficult with time zones, and you prefer to be over here in person.
I do. I prefer to be there in person, but I was glad to be part of this event, and thank you for the opportunity to present to everybody.
Cool, thank you, John.
Okay, thank you.
Cool, so we're going to have a short break while we move over to the next speaker, do some technical wizardry on the booth back there. I could just do more terrible jokes if people want. No? I don't want to lose the crowd, so I might.